Good evening and welcome to the Dr. Maria Show. Well, good news for the world, at least I think so. Klaus Schwab has announced that he is stepping down from the World Economic Forum. As you know, Klaus Schwab developed the forum in 1971, initially just for Europe to look at their economy, finances, and also social issues. And it quickly evolved into the World Economic Forum. Well, you might think, well, what's this all about? It's good if finances do better. But Klaus Schwab is a very controversial figure. Born in Germany, still has a home in Germany, a home in Switzerland, maybe worth $1 billion, born in 1938, has different ideas of what society should look like and a great reset. And the pandemic really sparked it for him. And remember, the majority of citizens around the world felt like they were living in totalitarian times. They were being told they couldn't go to church. They couldn't go to the grocery store. They could go to a liquor store. I mean, things didn't make any sense. We weren't following science principles. And he looked at this as, ooh, what a great time to reset. There's some different opinions of why he's stepping down now. There was some accusations from people within the World Economic Forum about misbehavior with women. And he did say that probably the number 2 spot would go to a family member. Initially, people thought, well, it might go to Yuval Harari. Yuval Harari is a young man born in 1976, Israeli, a historian, but he has very, very radical ideas for the world. He is quoted as saying, we need to decrease the population by 90%. 90%. He is often the World Economic Forum and Harari and Klaus Schwab have big endowment from the Bill Gates Society. And remember, Bill Gates also thinks that we are overpopulated, and there are a lot of theories out there. They're now into a lot of food and making not real food, right? We keep pushing a healthier society is eating farm to table, no preservatives. They're looking at artificial foods. And does this mean there's going to be things in it that help us not reproduce? So I never trusted the World Economic Forum. As you could see, it was the elites that would be flown. Actually, they would do it on their own dime, because I was shocked one time. I think it was a mistake. I got an invite. I'm just a paycheck to paycheck hospital CEO. Why would they invite me? Most of the times it's world leaders, royalty, billionaires. And these people would lecture everybody about carbon footprint, but they would all fly in with their private jets. It's just something to keep an eye on, because what Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum want to do is really have a communist society where very few people, the elites, will have money and everybody else has to kick and scratch their way for anything. Now, of course, he presents it differently. Just watch this.
I find it fascinating, and it's actually the new world, and it's also built on the platform concept. You create a platform where everybody can share goods, services, and this will be very much the future. The future will not necessarily anymore a world where people own things, but a world where people share things. Now, this has quite some implications on the economy, because you have to produce less goods in order to achieve the same satisfaction. You can share the goods. We haven't, with the World Economic Forum is engaged into a big program to look at the implications. For example, how does it affect property activity increase? How does it affect the measurement of GDP? So it's a new world. It's a fascinating world. and it will be the world of the future. We will share much more what we are now used to own.
Klaus Schwab is often credited for the term, "You will have nothing and you will be happy," when in actuality it was a Danish man, politician, or it could have been a lady, Ida Aachen, who coined that. She did a paper for the World Economic Forum saying nobody will own anything, everybody will be happy, you share it. So she makes it look like utopia. Everybody's happy, everybody's getting along. But it's just something to watch out for, and look at who's attending in Davos. You know, President Trump did attend, but he was very much into capitalist theories, capitalist nation, the United States, in putting America first. So he didn't hold back anything. Well, moving on to my next story. Peter Janney grew up in Washington, D.C. His father was a high-ranking CIA official. Well, he wrote a book, Mary's Mosaic, the CIA conspiracy, murder of John F. Kennedy, Mary Meyer, and their vision for world peace. Who really murdered Mary Meyer in the fall of 1964? Why was there a mad rush by the CIA to get to her home and find her diary? Well, here to help us figure this out is Peter Janney. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now tell us about Mary Pinchot Meyer.
Well, this is an extraordinary woman who was way ahead of her times. And she was a very progressive, soul-searching individual, artist, grew up quite wealthy, had the best of education, that kind of thing. And I think her experience with psychedelics really expanded the nature of her being into places that she had never been to before. So that is a huge...
He was credited with LSD, right? Developing LSD.
Well, she didn't develop it. She was a user of it.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about Timothy Leary, her friend.
Yes. And it was, Timothy was, of course, way into LSD, but I think his favorite was psilocybin, which is kind of the same kind of psychedelic dimension of LSD, but it's a little bit different.
Now, you're saying in the book, Mary Pinchot Meyer was a long-term mistress of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Is there proof of that?
Oh, yes, quite a bit. There isn't any dispute about that reality. As to what they did and where they went and how deep they went, I think my book begins to elaborate on that. This was an encounter that took place when both of them were in prep school. Actually, JFK had just graduated from prep school. He was in his first year of college when he went back to his prep school to do something called the Winter Festivities Weekend. It was a big dance. A lot of young girls came because they wanted to be at the school and be part of it. And this was the first time that JFK laid eyes on Mary Meyer. And it was a life-changing event for him and eventually her.
And when he became president, did she move to Washington, D.C.?
She's already there.
I see.
Yep.
And tell us the circumstances around her death.
Well, Mary was a big believer in the fact that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald who assassinated JFK. And she did her own research post assassination in Dallas. And, she was about to go public with what she had discovered. She really wanted to make sure that American citizens had access to the real truth of what had taken place. And that was too much for certain forces in our government. They wanted to protect the myth that there was no conspiracy in JFK's assassination, that it had been done by one quote unquote lone nut assassin by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. And that was a huge lie.
And how did she die?
Gunshots. She took one gunshot to the head and another gunshot behind her back underneath her scapula that just ripped apart her aorta.
Mm. Was she found in her own apartment?
No, she was taking a walk on this well-known traversed path called the towpath in Washington, the Chesapeake and Ohio towpath. And that was part of her day. She would paint and work in the morning, go for a long walk, usually along the canal around noontime, lunchtime. And that's when the deed was done.
So she was known to do that. So that's a pattern where if somebody wants to do her harm, they know her routine, and it's unsolved. But you've done a lot of research, Peter. Tell us what you think happened to Mary and why.
Mary was a threat to the established government in Washington because she was a truth seeker. She was a truth teller. And she was not going to allow the forces in our government that had assassinated JFK, she was not going to allow that to continue. She was a very well thought of woman, very respected, certainly, not a bimbo of any shape or kind. And had she gone public, had she had the opportunity to go fully public with what she knew and what she had discovered, it would have been a huge problem post JFK assassination.
It seems to be in that within weeks of the Warren Commission finishing and actually releasing their conclusion, that's when her murder occurred.
Well, the release of the Warren Commission was on September 26th, 1964, and she was killed on October 12th. So about 2 weeks after the release is when her death took place.
And how do you know, Peter, that a CIA official went looking for her diary?
That's not a disputed fact. I mean, it's an accepted except that post her murder, that night in her studio, Ben Bradley and Jim Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief, were rummaging through her studio to find the diary, which they did. And Bradley gave it to Jim Angleton, who said he would destroy it, but he never did. And eventually got back to one of Mary's very close friends. But the diary was never published so that someone in the general public could go through it page by page. We have little snippets here and there, but unfortunately for posterity, the diary was eliminated, destroyed.
And, that's a pretty horrific crime, especially when you think about 1964, 2 gunshot wounds like that, a murder of a woman, especially a connected woman. At the time, what were the papers reporting? That it was just a random murder?
Well, the papers were reporting what the government wanted the papers to report, which is they had found this young African American man down near the murder scene, and they immediately went to work on trying to pin the murder on him. They had absolutely no evidence. The young man was taken by an attorney, a woman attorney who's very well now known and very famous now, and she defended him, and he was acquitted.
Hmm. And, you make a claim that you think you've solved the murder. Tell us about that.
Well, it's just a matter of, over time putting the pieces together. Growing up in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s and 1960s, had its own history, had its own culture. And I was one of many CIA young brats. A lot of times we all socialized together. Our house had this really beautiful swimming pool, so there were these in the summer swimming parties where all the CIA people and their brats would come and hang out together. So I caught a glimpse of what was really going on beneath the scenes. Plus, I had this father who was a very high official. So I had a kind of access. And having, gone to school, become a PhD clinical psychologist, you have to learn people in one way or another. And since I had caught glimpses of a lot of these CIA people and other people in the government in Washington, it was clear to me as to who they are, who they were, and what they were really up to.
And I'm trying to get a sense, Peter. It's so you think Mary was murdered by CIA because she had information about JFK's murder, or a theory about the murder of JFK assassination?
Both.
Both.
She had specific research that she had done because she had access to a lot of inside government people, particularly people who knew more of what was really going on in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. And, Mary was courageous enough to just say, I am not going to allow my government to pull the wool over everyone's eyes and sell them, a crock of, I won't say the word, but I'm sure you know what I'm going.
Yes, and RFK Jr., our President Kennedy's nephew, has publicly said always that he thought the CIA was involved. Now, recently, papers were released on the JFK assassination. I have not read them. I'm sure you were poring over them with great enthusiasm. No.
I'm a believer that our government doesn't really want you to know the truth, the real truth. So what came out of this recent release was just gobbledygook. I haven't seen or heard anything that's new there, really new. And our government wants to keep it that way. Do you think people in our government are actually going to come out and admit, oh yeah, we made a mistake. We did assassinate JFK because we thought this or we thought that. It's not going to happen here.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just like I thought between the time of this, the Biden administration to the Trump administration, I'm like, oh my God, the shredders are working overtime because of how innocent American citizens were attacked. I thought, we're not going to find evidence of that because they're going to shred everything. But I thought maybe the naive side of me thought, probably most of those people are dead now. And maybe there was an internal investigation report somewhere, but Apparently not.
No, it's you're never going to get the truth. I mean, you will get the truth if you work hard enough to put all the pieces of the information together, because it solves a very big piece of a puzzle. But you will also learn in that process to what degree forces in our government go on protecting lies, not the truth of what really happened in the JFK assassination, but what our government wants you to believe.
Yes, they're quite skilled at propaganda, which really disheartens the general American public, because we have a dream, and that dream is called America, the beacon of light of individual liberty and freedom. And we've seen behavior that goes back. Some people think it's gone back to the Roosevelt administration, when it was hijacked by a lot of communists, but that we've been being fed a line of crap for a very long time. I think that the people are finally standing up. I, like many others, just trusted everybody was going to do the right thing. I never really paid attention, even when I would hear things over the last 3-4 decades. Oh, that's not good. That's a corrupt politician. There's probably enough good ones to balance it. But my eyes have been open. But Peter, how do people get your... Oh, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
Why would the CIA want to kill the president of the United States?
Because he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do. He was quickly, with Mary Myers' help and assistance, really psychologically working on himself to really become and understand the president that he was destined to be. And he really saw how nefarious our intelligence service system is, and that it would not care a twit about selling us propaganda to keep us away from the real truth. And essentially, that is what has gone on for the last 60 years.
Yeah, it is very, very sad. Do you know if they haven't closed Mary Myers' murder, right? Is there a cold case review team looking at it?
No. They have let that. They have let that go.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, maybe your book will spark some questions and put some pressure to finally legitimately solve it. But I'm with you. I think there's certain things in life that we know we're never going to get accountability or transparency.
Well, some of us keep working for that. And I will want to tell you and your audience that there are 2 films in the works now. One documentary about my book, me and how it was written, and one Hollywood bio-series about the story of JFK and Mary, and what happened, all based on my book.
Well, congratulations on that. And I really look forward to seeing those movies. How do people get your book?
Very easy. Just go on Amazon, type in Mary's Mosaic in the search box, and it'll take you right there.
Well, thank you for spending time with us this evening, Peter. Best of luck to you.
My pleasure, Maria. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, that was fascinating. I have to tell you the truth. I had never heard the name Mary Myers. I've heard other women's names associated with the president in somebody else's name totally. I won't even say it because maybe it's, I heard it from a Washington type person, but it wasn't Mary Meyer. It was another name that was a longtime girlfriend. And of course, there's been revelations for a long time that he had many, many extramarital affairs. But I am very excited about this book and about the movies to come, because President Kennedy was our president. It doesn't matter about parties. Like he was ours. And he is really honored. He had some forward thinking initiatives going on in the White House, but I never really could wrap my mind around it. I've heard it forever that the CIA took him out, but I never really understood why. And probably because until President Trump, I never realized we have an ecosystem within the ecosystem, if you know what I mean, hence deep state. I didn't realize other people are really running things, and not everybody has the best intentions. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be back with you soon.
Let me ask you, do you ever think about what's in energy drinks? Well, it's time we did. Introducing Rev 7, a premium energy drink that's actually good for you, and it tastes great and gives you energy all day. Plus, it has no sugar or caffeine, so you won't experience those jitters and crashes that we've all been through with the other energy drinks. And what makes Rev 7 so special is that it's powered with Cognizant, a premium nootropic that helps fuel your mind, and Go BHB, which is a primary ketone in your body that provides the most efficient and cleanest fuel ever. It's a game changer when it comes to consuming less sugar and caffeine and still getting the energy we need. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to save 20%. And I'm so sure you're going to love Rev 7. For a limited time, try our introductory 3-pack absolutely free.
Are you looking for monthly income without the risk of stocks? Here's something you won't hear on CNBC. There's actually a unique way to collect royalties directly from America's most productive oil fields. No exploring, drilling, or operational headaches. You simply collect checks month after month. The best part? You can get started with just $25 through any brokerage account. The Oxford Club's chief income strategist, Mark Lichtenfeld, breaks down what he believes is the #1 oil royalty play for 2025. Visit mariaoilboom.com now to learn more. That's right, mariaoilboom.com. Stop buying oil stocks and start collecting oil royalty checks instead.
Here we are, pretty much at the beginning of the process here at this pristine, I call it a laboratory. It's not like a factory, it's like a hospital. This is the beginning of the process for roasting. Deep grain, very good quality. Most people don't use this quality. We deal with small farmers because they like to know who we're dealing with. They give us the highest quality, all organic, non-GMO. You should know all Arabica beans, no Robusto, all Arabica. They're going to go into the roaster, and it'll get roasted for about 20 minutes or so. Oh my goodness, look at these. My goodness. You're going to want to specially order these. This is what goes into Rudy's coffee.
Whether it's being a weekend warrior or spending time with your family, feeling your best is the key to doing the things you love. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Nirvanta. It's a natural solution designed to help you stay active and live well naturally. Nirvanta is a topical blend of all natural essential oils like frankincense, myrrh, and a proprietary gold standard plant stock extract. It's perfect for your hands, feet, knees, back, or anywhere else that needs a little extra care. Use Nirvanta proactively as part of your daily maintenance routine, and you're guaranteed you're going to feel the difference. Simply massage Nirvanta in for at least 60 seconds, 2 to 3 times a day to get the best results. And if you're not completely satisfied, you get your money back. No questions asked. There's simply no risk and no reason not to try Nirvanta today. Right now, you get 15% off with code Lindell exclusively at nirvantahealth.com. So stop reaching out for that medicine cabinet. Get Nirvanta instead and experience the difference. Go to nirvantahealth.com. Use code Lindell to get 15% off today. Nirvanta Health. Live well naturally.
Welcome back. As you know, I've been very, very passionate about what was happening at our southern border, as well as the northern border, but certainly the crimes, the assaults on children and women, terrorists, Chinese nationals, all these gang members coming through our southern border. Well, that's literally come to a halt now. But now we have to deal with the 1.4, 1.5 million illegal aliens who've come into our country. So the Trump administration is going to enforce the 1996 law that you can fine illegal aliens. You could even seize property. Well, we've often talked about how government agencies don't talk to one another and how the FBI not talking to the CIA and vice versa led to 9/11. I am very happy to say DHS and IRS are agreeing to talk to ICE agents. When are we going to get the states to do it? Of course, we have radically left governors who are saying, or mayors for that matter, saying they just won't cooperate. And the really odd thing is they're not cooperating with some of the most vicious animals on our planet. Men who are murdering, raping women and children, and they don't want to tell ICE they're in the court system so they could pick them up. Like, somebody please help me understand that logic in that inhumanity. I just can't believe it. But thousands, they say, our government is saying right now, thousands are self-deporting. So I know I saw a little commercial by Kristi Noem saying, you know what? If you self-deport ASAP, you can apply to come in legally. You know, the pundits are trying a lot of fear mongering that, you know, the good guy down the street who's been in the country 20 years, even though he came in illegally, he owns the grocery store down the street. His kids go to the school. They're lovely people. Right now, President Trump, Tom Homan are talking about the worst of the worst. We have to find out a way to deal with the scenario I just said, because they did come in illegally. But I often said under President Biden, did they know they were breaking the law? When you had a president encouraging people to surge the border, when you had a president who would authorize millions upon millions of dollars to NGOs, including Catholic charities, to help illegals come into the country. Did some of the people, the good people, really know they were breaking the law? I've often pondered that. But let's look at this clip of illegal aliens. So as you can see with that clip, those were the big caravans. That's not happening anymore. Literally, we are closed. Obviously, the nefarious people are going to try to get in undetected. That is still happening. There has still been seizures of drugs. One of the parts that after the Biden administration finally heard our cries, they didn't for like 3.5 years. They didn't hear our concerns about safety of American citizens. They seemed to be numb to the fact that there was 300,000 missing children that came through that border, presumed to be in either labor camps or sex trafficking rings. Finally, it gets near election time and they have to do something about the numbers. So they make this app where illegal aliens can fly directly into your city or state, and then they're not counted in the numbers. So the Trump administration's trying to unravel all of that. And Auden Cabello is here today to help me understand everything that's been going on. He spent a lot of time at the southern border. Welcome, Auden.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
So, as a independent journalist, is that what drew you to the southern border, to capture what was happening?
Actually, what drove me to the border is I'm from West Texas, and my wife is a Mexican national. And so I was living in Del Rio at the time when we married. She's from Piedras Negras, across from Eagle Pass. And so we married in Del Rio. Our firstborn, was born in Del Rio. And in the meantime, we're doing her process to get her green card. We essentially got denied. And this is during the first Trump administration. And so we had to relocate to the Mexican side in Acuña, Mexico. And that's where I lived for 8 years with her until we were able to do our second process and finally got approved. And we just recently relocated back to West Texas. But for that whole time that I was in Mexico as a U.S. citizen, trying to get my wife over legally, my son was born in Del Rio on the U.S. side, my daughter in Mexico in Acuña. And now as a profession, I'm a photographer, videographer, and I started using my gear to just go out there and photograph Lake Amistad there in Del Rio and the Rio Grande River. And so it came to the point where I started noticing people crossing the Rio Grande River, and I started documenting it. And so it wasn't prior to when we had the 15,000 Haitians encamped underneath the International Bridge that I had captured a group of about 200, 300 Haitians in Acuña, and I filmed them and also got drone footage of them crossing the Rio Grande River. And on this particular occasion, I decided to go to the U.S. side into Del Rio and film them while they were already on the U.S. side, just to get a complete narrative of the whole story. Them in Mexico crossing the Rio Grande, and then on the U.S. side in Del Rio. And so when I show up there to the location, and at the time there was no media there, no media coverage, because this was the initial phase of the Haitians arriving there in Del Rio. And so when I showed up, there was one cameraman, a reporter, and then a producer walked out of the vehicle and approached me, and he asked me, he's like, "What network are you with? Who do you work for?" I'm like, "Well, I'm just a local. I just happened to document this group a while ago in Mexico when they were crossing, and also drone footage." And that's when he asked me, like, "Do you mind if I see the footage?" And I showed it to him, and he's like, "Oh, I need that. How can we get that from you?" And it turned out that reporter was Mil Malusian and the crew. And so that was
awesome.
the initial, our initial encounter, and that's where we established a friendship. And we worked throughout these 4 years of the Biden border crisis. If you go back and look at his reporting, and if you look closely, a lot of the footage that was used by Fox News and other networks was mine. And occasionally they made reference to me. Back then, I was only a source on the ground or a source in Mexico. And it wasn't until Ben Bergquam and Mr. Bannon invited me to the war room, and that I became a face. That they attached a face to that person or source on the ground, and Steve Bannon was like, we don't want to see your footage. We want to hear directly from you. You live there. You live on the border. You live it. What are we missing? What are the networks not covering? And so living on the Mexican side, it gave me a completely different perspective on what was happening there at the border. And so even with the Haitians, I took several journalists to the crossing point, and at the time, what I noticed is the Haitians, right before they crossed, they were dumping their documents, their IDs, and so I started collecting all these documents. And it wasn't until Todd Bensman from Center for Immigration Studies and Ben Berkwam that I took them to that location that we realized that these Haitians were not coming directly from Haiti. They were coming from Chile and Brazil, where they had been living for years. And that's why they were dumping those IDs, and they reported that, and that became a big story. And there was a lot of documentation that I had collected from that just one location. And so fast forward to Biden's final 2 years in office, or the 3 years, the whole crossing point transferred there from Del Rio over to Eagle Pass. And that's where I was also on the ground on the Mexican side, covering all the migrants. As far south as Tapachula, Chiapas, where I went and got a better understanding of the migrant crisis. Ground zero, what I got to understand there in Tapachula, what was happening, and also in Monterrey, which is in central northern Mexico, where these migrants were taking the train. And also a lot of that footage was mined, used by Fox News and other networks. I was capturing all of the migrants on train once they left the caravans and made it to central Mexico. And that's how they would arrive there to Piedras Negras. It was a direct train route. And they would cross the Rio Grande into Eagle Pass and turning themselves into Border Patrol agents. And then we all know the rest of the story, into how they would get processed, released to NGOs, and then transported to different communities across the United States. And this is where we're at now, living having to deal with the consequences and the aftermath of Biden's border crisis.
Auden, you saw that I reacted when you said Bill Mnuchin, because a lot of us were like, wow, Bill is getting such great footage and he's really breaking these stories. And come to find out, it was all a lot of your documentation. So I thank you so wholeheartedly, because the legacy media was covering up for the Biden administration what was happening at that southern border. Early on, senators who visited the southern borders would find the bracelets that the cartel would give, and they would charge people different rates depending where they're from. And they really determined who came in our country. Did you see those bracelets as well? And did you have an understanding of what those were for?
Yeah, so I never did cover that part. This was happening in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And so on the Mexican side, they were crossing to the state of Tamaulipas, which is controlled by the cartels. To this date, there's still several cartels fighting for territory there. And we're seeing some of that reporting over the turf wars. And so what was happening, these same migrants that would arrive on train, in Monterrey, it would split in three ways. So one route would go to Juarez, and that's why Juarez and El Paso at some point was a hotspot. And then also in Piedras Negras and into Eagle Pass, and then another hotspot was in Reynosa, and they were crossing to the Rio Grande Valley. The only difference is in the Tamaulipas state, like I said, is controlled by the cartels, so these migrants had to pay a fee, around $5,000 to cross through their territory and into the U.S. Where I was covering is the state of Coahuila. There is no open cartel operating there. In Juarez is the state of Chihuahua. There is some cartel activity there, but also depending on where they crossed. If it was more towards New Mexico, then there was cartel activity there. But if it was there by the port of entry, more likely it's just migrants that had arrived on train and made it by themselves there, where the crossing point into El Paso. But yeah, the risk was a form of control of who had paid their fee to cross through the cartel's territory. And once they made it into the U.S., they would cut off those bracelets. But it was a very controlled flow of migrants. And like I said, going down to Tapachula and seeing Ground Zero, how they all arrived there once they crossed the Darien Gap through Colombia and Panama and central Mexico. Once they arrived in southern Mexico, you would see how they would all get filtered. And that's where I learned something that, that stuck with me to understand how and where the migrants are crossing. And so I've summed it up saying, depending on their economic status and where they're from, would determine where they crossed and how they crossed. And so the ones that I was documenting was mainly the poorest of the poor. And that's why these are the ones that would leave in caravans out of southern Mexico. And they're the same ones that once they arrived in central Mexico would hop on the train and make it to one of these routes on the train, whether it was in Juarez, El Paso, Piedras Negras, Eagle Pass, or into Reynosa in the Rio Grande Valley. And so those that had more money, Chinese, Indians, and other nationalities, they would probably pay the cartels or corrupt officials, whether it's at the state or federal level, and they will get flown to airports near the border and cross. And if you see any footage of either from Arizona or California, you notice that some of them still have their luggage, their neck pillows, and that's because they flew into those areas. They had the money and the resources to pay for that. And so that's the biggest distinction that I've learned amongst, just going to Tapachula and understanding how this flow was very organized and orchestrated by the Biden administration.
It certainly seemed it. And I recall, 4 years ago, I had a radio show and I kept talking about it because I was very, very concerned, not only about terrorists coming into the country, but what was happening to some of these women and children on the route, the brutal rapes. Tom Homan talks about that mothers put their children, and I'm talking about preteen children, on birth control because they knew they would be raped. And we learned about the rape trees. But in talking to everyday citizens, there were those who were knowledgeable, would see the Bill Mnuchin reports or the Tom Homan speeches, because he had an agency called Border 911. But there was a whole group of people who are like, that's happening at our southern border. I didn't know that. When the report of the bracelets first came out, I like to talk to everybody. And how do you feel about that? What? That's happening? They were really naive that the cartels were involved. They were really naive about how brutal the trek was and how it's not humanitarian to support that action because of what was happening, particularly to the women and children. Being on the Mexican side, did the Mexican people understand the brutality that was happening to within some of these caravans?
As a matter of fact, no, and that's a great question. I know you mentioned Mr. Tom Homan, who I had the privilege of working with, and a lot of his staff at Border 911. As a matter of fact, the cap over my shoulder, that's from Victor Avila. It's a Border 911 hat that I probably wear. And so, yeah, Mexican people were pretty much unaware of what's happening. Even they would learn what was happening there in Piedras Negras from my reporting, because that's where I lived there in Acuña on the Mexican side. And they would learn what was happening in their city from my reporting. They wouldn't see it in the streets. That's how controlled it was on the Mexican side. And when it came to the rapes and all the risks that the migrants were going through, one of the questions that I asked, I had pretty much the same question for everybody, is like, which country are you from? What was the hardest part of your journey? And for the most part, I would say 95%, it wasn't the Darien Gap. We've seen so many stories about the Darien Gap, that jungle where many have lost their life. Their biggest complaint was Mexico and the corruption and the everything that they went through. And of course, the women, like you said, they would be there in the Darien Gap. They would be giving rape kits, which included condoms and other forms. It's like they were being prepared. It's like, you're going to get raped on the journey, but that's part of the price you're having to pay. And so a few that I interviewed that would open up, because most of them didn't want to talk about it. They said, "Yeah, I experienced it, but I don't want to talk about it." So the few that did talk about it, in Mexico, they were being raped by law enforcement, corrupt officials, and like I said, because some of the ones that I was covering, they were the poorest of the poor, and so they didn't have money to pay these officials, and the only way they could pay is being raped. And that was one of the consequences of going through those areas. And so, yes, it was happening. I think it was very underreported because there was no footage of it. A lot of times, when once they made it to the border, whether it was cartels or the corrupt officials, they would confiscate their phones and make sure they deleted any footage that they had. And so it was very hard to prove what was happening. Some of them did have footage, but it got deleted or they weren't willing to share it. So that's a new story that really went underreported because there was no evidence to back it up.
And I cried for these women. I cried for the children. Again, Tom Holman told me another story of a little boy who was so brutally raped multiple times. He was like 8 years old. He had to wear a diaper. So there's not only psychological issues because they're victims of a very brutal crime. There's probably no resources to help them through that, but there's physical ramifications. So it's very concerning how my country handled all of that and turned a blind eye. But what are you doing now, Auden? Are you compiling all of the things that you saw, or what's your next project?
So now that I'm not at the border, and so my saying now is I left the border, but the border didn't leave me. So I show up here in West Texas, and this large community of Cubans and Venezuelans, and I still do interviews. I get their perspective on news, what's happening. Here lately, I've been doing interviews. I still provide consultation, whether it's for documentaries, movies, and going back to Mr. Tom Holman and the children. Now that I'm in West Texas, here recently, Doge, we saw the reporting that they were closing down a NGO in Pecos, Texas, which is here in West Texas. And I so happen to have cousins that work there. And another one that it was in a shelter in Corpus Christi. And at the time, they couldn't speak. They knew I was reporting at the border and the border crisis and everything that was going on. But they couldn't speak to me. They couldn't share information of what was happening. But now they're no longer employed there, and they shared some stories with me, and it's very heartbreaking. I think that's another task that independent journalists or any journalist should go out there and try to interview employees or ex-employees of these shelters, especially the ones that were taking care of children. And my biggest surprise was hearing that we hear about kids being raped or the women being raped and children. But to me, what really shocked me the most is knowing that the majority of those that were being raped were young boys. And some of these were being treated for trauma here in the Pecos shelter. And some of those were taken to hospitals here in the area in Fort Stockton, where I also have a cousin that works there in the hospital. And he's the one that told me most of the patients were young boys that had been raped. So there's a lot that, again, was not covered or underreported, but that's something that really should touch every American on what was happening at the border. And, that was at the hands of the Biden administration.
Absolutely. The devil was dancing these last 4 years. And I pray to God for these children and the victims of these horrific crimes. Well, Auden, I can't thank you enough for joining my show tonight, and I look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
It was my pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's tough to hear these stories, and I've been hearing them for 4 or 5 years, and I'm the type of people, it's funny, I worked in emergency medicine and saw terrible things, homicides, rapes, whatever, and you always have to go to the next patient, and we learned really good to push down those feelings, but it's something about children children, when they are victimized, it stays with me, it haunts me. And this is where I think we need communities. We got to stick up for our most vulnerable, right? It doesn't matter what political party you belong to. Let's make a commitment to stand up for the innocent, the young people, and the elderly and the vulnerable. As always, I thank you for joining me. 9 p.m. LindellTV.com every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I will see you on Monday.